are listening to Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast with your hosts, John and Darren.
Welcome to Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. I'm your host, John, and I'm here with my co-host, Darren. And today we are tackling the big one, Ozzy versus Dio. All right, well, let's get a few rules in place here before we get started. First of all, this is not a competition. Both Darren and I, we love both Ozzy and Dio. It's just more of a analyzing where they sit in the history of the band. We're also going to be including Considering the Devil You Know as a Black Sabbath album and everything but title. And I guess that's really about it. So we can jump into it. Darren, Ozzy versus Dio, where are you at on it?
Well, it's like you said, it's not a competition, but it's funny. The reason I thought about discussing it is because a lot of times, and I'll see on social media or anywhere on the internet where people get very possessive about the two eras, from both sides. People that are very defensive of the Ozzy era have no tolerance for anything that came after. And then likewise, people are really possessive over the Dio era as being like their definitive Black Sabbath. And it's weird that the two don't seem to be, I mean, in some cases they do, but generally speaking, it's more often than not, I see this division. It's like both sides of the spectrum can't coexist. And I think it's strange because, I mean, it's all the same band, and there's a lot of things about both eras that are very different. There's no denying that, but there also is the predominant presence of Tony Iommi and his riffs and his tone. And I mean, that I think is the main thing that identifies Black Sabbath is Tony Iommi, his guitar tone. But the thing about it is that I guess you have to understand how different the two are in order to really relate to the argument that people sometimes have. And it's like it's two completely different bands, with the commonality being Tony Iommi's guitar. But I mean, you look at where Black Sabbath left off with Ozzy, and you could feel it sort of petering out, different musical things, genres, styles being brought into the band, getting far away from the original plot. And now Never Say Die is pretty well revered, more so than I think sometimes it deserves to be. But sometimes age makes people more fond of things as time goes on. But Never Say Die really seemed to be a band that was in distress, and there was a lot of strange things going on in the music that didn't really exemplify what was part of Black Sabbath prior to that. So in 2 years' time, basically the band reinvented themselves into this rejuvenated heavy metal band that is very very different and very inspired sounding. More so, and I think that's one of the main differences is the inspired sound of the new Black Sabbath with Dio. I mean, everything from the songs, the lyrical subject matter, the playing. I mean, the performances seem more aggressive, whereas things kind of started to wind down a little bit on Never Say Die. things kind of kicked back a little bit. But then, and 2 years later, 1980, everything sort of was rejuvenated, and there was an excitement, and it was definitely very, very different. That's pretty much my take on it. I see it as like somebody hit the reset button on Black Sabbath, and it was a complete. Basically, they figuratively, not literally, but figuratively, they cleaned house. Of course, the only member that wasn't there anymore was Ozzy. But when Dio came in, I think the dynamic of the band changed pretty significantly, and also I think that I guess the way that they did things also changed. Dio came in with more of a I think prior to that, Geezer was writing the lyrics, and I think Heaven and Hell, the first Black Sabbath album with Dio, you could tell. I mean, if you followed Rainbow at all, you could tell that a lot of the lyrics are coming from Dio. So that was one major shift that was pretty profound, and also changed the personality of the band. I mean, that, when there's a change that significant, I mean, it's bound to have some pushback from people, and that's exactly what happened. But what's weird about it is it still goes on today. You think, 30 years later, 40 years later, that things would have kind of like subsided, but it doesn't really seem to, and it's kind of an interesting thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things that set up why some people may prefer Dio or why some people may prefer Ozzy. Ozzy, of course, has the advantage of being the first guy in the band.
Yeah.
So for a lot, and some of it is where you came into the band. If you're somebody that, you discovered Black Sabbath during mob rolls, you may not have, that may have been your gateway into the band.
Sure.
And, Ozzy was the first guy. And the other thing is that Ozzy, it isn't a situation like, let's say, AC/DC. Okay, you're talking about bands that had big singer changes.
Sure.
And in AC/DC, Bon Scott died. So Bon Scott, it isn't like Bon Scott left and then Bon Scott had a successful solo career that was running at the same time as the Brian Johnson era of AC/DC. So even though, of course, in the AC/DC world, there's people pick sides with that, but I think it's a little different because Ozzy, he had a very successful solo career that started at pretty much the exact same time that the Dio era started with Black Sabbath. It kept Ozzy in the public eye, and even though this is the thing about Ozzy, when you compare Ozzy and Dio to each other, if I asked my parents if they knew who Ozzy Osbourne was, they would immediately say yes. If I asked my parents if they knew who Ronnie James Dio was, I'm pretty sure they would say no.
Yeah.
So because of Ozzy's presence, it hung over the Dio era, maybe more than if Ozzy had just fallen off the map. I'm trying to think off my head some band that had an iconic singer that just disappeared, but I can't think of one. But, if Ozzy had just disappeared, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. And the other thing is, Ozzy had 8 albums. Dio had, if we count The Devil You Know, Dio has 4. Ozzy has 9, actually, if we count 13. So, there's always been that. And, in the band, never really helped that either. Like the way things happened with Dehumanizer, with the story of how Ronnie left because they were doing these shows with Ozzy. It was never really like Black Sabbath was able to completely cut the cord with Ozzy. They did Live Aid together. There was always still some sort of connection, and even when they were feuding, it still kept them connected. The Speak of the Devil versus Live Evil, it still kept them connected in a way. So it's like the shadow of Ozzy just sort of hangs large over the band, and it's unfair, I think, because Dio, like you mentioned, Dio came in and it is a shift in the direction of the band. I would say that it probably would have happened anyways with Ozzy. If you sort of look at look at what Ozzy did in 1980 with Blizzard of Oz. That album doesn't sound anything like
No,
what he was
no,
doing
not at all.
with Black Sabbath. So that was just sort of some sort of subconscious shift in the metal world. And you think of all the albums that came out in 1980, British Steel, Ace of Spades, the two Saxon records, Heaven and Hell, Blizzard of Oz, they're all real kind of stepping away from the 60s, 70s, more focused. The songs are a little tighter. The production is tighter, doing away with the jamming and the experimenting that all these bands did in the 70s, Scorpions, Animal Magnetism. Everybody's just seemed to, at the same time, do that in 1980. So,
Yeah.
that's what happened with, I think Sabbath would have done that anyways, even if Dio was there. Maybe it wouldn't have been as profound as with Dio. But again, I think it's just because Ozzy's shadow is so large, and because he is such a public figure and has really not left the public eye really at any point. I mean, when he was in Black Sabbath, his solo career started in 1980, and you can say what you want about Ozzy in the 90s, but Ozzy is a guy whose name has always been out there. He's always been in the public eye. He never completely disappears for 10 years or something like that. So because of that, the name Black Sabbath is always connected to him, and his shadow just runs really large.
It does. The other thing is, I think there was rivalry that was constantly being, recycled, and it was. I remember on the Diary of a Madman tour when Ozzy would hang the midget. His name was Ronnie because he was a midget. So he's just taking swipes at Dio's height, And if you were, I was an Ozzy fan in the early '80s. I mean, to me, Black Sabbath was Ozzy, and even though I did eventually get Heaven and Hell, I didn't get it at the same time that I got Blizzard of Oz. It was a couple years later. Well, it wasn't a couple years later. It was within, I think it was around 1981. It was before, I know Mob Rules came out in '81, but I did get Heaven and Hell just a little while before Mob Rules came out. But I was still kind of reluctant. I was on Team Ozzy, and then Ozzy was. He definitely was larger than life, and I think that management really helped that along. I think, and probably the reason was that if we all know the story, Sharon was rebelling against her father, who was still managing Black Sabbath at the time. Her pet project was Ozzy, so she used Ozzy as the weapon against her father management with Black Sabbath. So she was promoting Ozzy, and this, the Dove incident, that wasn't an accident. Even though it seems like the explanation for it is pretty innocent. Oh yeah, well, Ozzy had these doves, and I told him when he went to the press conference to let the doves out, and he was drunk and he grabbed one and he bit its head off. Well, that's more consistent with the image of Ozzy at that time, coming from Black Sabbath, the guy that the maniacal, heavy metal, crazy guy biting the head off a dove, as opposed to what the quote unquote original plan was, to let the doves. That was more like a Robert Plant. Ozzy wasn't a Robert Plant. He was a crazy, rock and roll madman, even though the term madman hadn't been designated for him just yet, but it was working towards that. And all the press, that's what, of course, Blizzard of Oz is an incredible album. So, musically, it was self-sufficient in that regard. But when you couple all of the press and all the tantalizing, things that were going on, as far as like what crazy thing he was doing was, really helping him along. And there was a rivalry. I'm not sure if it was really necessarily between Ozzy, the musician, and Black Sabbath, the band, or if it was between Sharon and Don Arden, because the whole Live Evil, or Speak of the Devil, Live Evil was a tit for tat. Black Sabbath was getting ready to come out with their live album, Live Evil, and Sharon quickly got the band to learn the Sabbath songs, and they recorded them at the Ritz in New York over 2 nights. And Brad Gillis had to learn those songs in like 3 nights or whatever it was. And I've heard both recordings, and the first night it was pretty rusty. I mean, as great as those musicians were, to learn, all those songs in a matter of days, and then have them recorded for a live album that was sort of all of a sudden conceived to compete with Black Sabbath's live album. And wasn't it strange that the Ozzy live album, even though he had 2 very successful albums under his belt at this point, wasn't it strange that they were all, the double live album was comprised entirely of Black Sabbath albums? And wasn't it strange that it came out right before or shortly before the Black Sabbath live album was supposed to be released? I think that did Live Evil come out in '82? I know that Speak of the Devil did, but I think they were only a few months apart. But I know that Speak of the Devil was rushed along to beat the Black Sabbath live album. And I know there was, the thing about how it was originally supposed to be a live album with Randy, but because Randy died, then they didn't think that it was very tasteful to do it at that point, but they still wanted to do it. Well, it would make more sense to shelve the idea of a live album altogether rather than just go ahead and record it all Black Sabbath songs. I mean, I don't know how stupid they think or how gullible they think people are, but it was obvious that there was some rivalry there. So I think that bled into the audience. I think they saw it, subconsciously they were being, fed that subliminally. And I think that lent itself to the taking sides thing, like, or you're either an Ozzy fan or you're a Dio fan. And I remember, 81, 82, my friends and I saying Dio sucks. I don't know why. He was great, and we liked the album. It was just that we were kind of like programmed that you could only like one or the other. And well, we heard Ozzy first in Black Sabbath, and then when his solo album came out, that was the first one we heard. So by default, we were on board with the Ozzy stuff. And
yeah, I just checked. Speak of the Devil came out in November of '82, and Live Evil came out in December of '82. So yeah, they came out literally within a month of each other. Yeah. I think the thing about Ozzy is that for as much as people are quick to kind of write him off as someone whose career has survived off the back of others, you'll often hear, he doesn't write his own lyrics. He doesn't really write the music and everything like that. There's a couple of things that I think that Ozzy has. First of all, you don't have a career as long as he does if there's not something there. Obviously, he brings something to the table. And to those people that as an aside, to those people who bring this up all the time, that Ozzy, he doesn't bring anything to the table, I tell them to search out the Dave Walker version of Junior's Eyes. Quick history: Ozzy briefly leaves before Never Say Die. Dave Walker comes in, and they recorded a version of Junior's Eyes with Dave Walker. Well, it is nowhere near as good as the Ozzy version. So that is proof right there of what Ozzy brings to the table. The other thing is that Ozzy always, 2 things: his voice and his personality. His personality has always been kind of like this lovable guy hanging around at the bar. This guy you want to root for. This kind of Ozzy always sort of downplays himself a little bit when he talks about himself. He's just sort of this lovable bloke that you want to sort of cheer for. And the other thing is his voice is, if you sit down and you add it up, Dio technically has a better voice than Ozzy does. He has a bigger range. He has more control over his voice than Ozzy. But Ozzy has such a unique quality to his voice. It stands out so much that anybody coming after him, anybody being compared to him, it's hard to compare yourself to him because he stands out so much in a unique way. You know, I once heard somebody say, the Ozzy era songs only sound right when Ozzy sings them.
Oh, it's true.
And it's,
Well,
you know, Dio can technically sing all the other singers that came afterwards can technically sing those songs. And what it
I
made
think
me,
Tony Martin did a really good job with the Ozzy stuff. Dio did not, and the proof of that is Live Evil. But
yeah. And if you think of it this way, think of I was thinking, okay, of an actor like Christopher Walken. Okay,
Mhm.
he's a guy that has a very unique way that he speaks, you know.
Yeah,
And if somebody else came in and tried to do some role that he had done, you know, it wouldn't be the same because he just has this unique way, such a unique way of speaking. And
right.
Ozzy has such a unique way of singing that when you have anybody else sing his stuff, it doesn't sound right. And like you said, the proof of that is Live Evil. Although there are some things that I think Dio sounds okay on singing on Live Evil, like I'm okay with like Children of the Grave kind of works for me, but like the song Black Sabbath doesn't work for me. You know, that to me is just,
Paranoid, I think, was the biggest fail on that album. NIB is pretty good. Can deal with that. Children of the Grave, I think, is fine. Black Sabbath he's just a little bit too melodramatic with it, but you know, it was just
yeah,
odd. It wasn't it just sounded very strained, you know. And I guess we're all used to hearing Ozzy sing those songs, and he made those songs what they are. And when you were talking about how Ozzy doesn't get enough credit, I totally agree. And I remember not that long ago there was somebody saying that the only reason Ozzy was a hack, and you know, it was everybody else that wrote the music, and oh well, Bob Daisley wrote the lyrics, and this and that, and Randy Rhoads was the real star of the show. Well, wasn't Randy Rhoads' Blizzard of Oz. It wasn't Bob Daisley's Blizzard of Oz, and it wasn't Lee Kerslake's Blizzard of Oz. It was Ozzy Osbourne's Blizzard of Oz. He was the one that sold it. And you know, most of the highlight of, I mean, of course, Bob Daisley was in Rainbow, and you know, he was in, what was he in before that? Cavish Jute, the Australian band, but I guess his
Widowmaker. Yeah.
Widowmaker, yeah. So he was in, you know, in other bands, but the big band was the Blizzard of Oz, you know, and Ozzy gave him, you know, a lot of identity from his involvement with those two albums. Now, I mean, likewise, Bob and Lee contributed a lot to that album, but I mean, I think if you remember the Living Loud project
Yeah.
with Jimmy Barnes on lead vocals, I think those guys really thought that they were going to show Ozzy up and be like, these are our songs, and we're going to have a popular Australian singer, Jimmy Barnes, who has a great voice and is very well regarded, and he's going to sing these songs better than Ozzy, and this album's going to be, it's going to be really popular. I think Steve Morse was playing guitar on it. It tanked because nobody wanted to hear it. No, I mean, they weren't bad, but Ozzy made those songs outstanding, you know.
Yeah.
And without him, I don't think, you know, Randy Rhoads wouldn't have become as popular as he is, and Bob Daisley wouldn't have had a career. And it's also telling that Bob Daisley, even as disgruntled as he apparently was, still continued to work with Ozzy for several years after that.
Yeah. And if you want further proof of what Ozzy brings to the table, the song "You Looking at Me, Looking at You,"
Yeah.
which for people out there was the B-side to Crazy Train, I think.
Yep. It was.
That was actually a Quiet Riot song. The chord progression, the guitar solo is lifted straight off of like the Quiet Riot version of the song.
Mhm.
Ozzy's vocals in Melody Line is completely different. It's slightly rearranged, and it's a completely different song and a much, much, much better song.
Yeah.
Because of it. If you listen to what Randy was doing with Quiet Riot, honestly, the songs weren't really that great. And it wasn't until he got together with Ozzy and Bob Daisley and all that it all sort of came together. And everybody likes to dump on Sharon, but Sharon Osbourne even once said, if Ozzy is such a joke and all these other people were so instrumental in making him successful, how come haven't had
Yeah.
success after
That's
they
absolutely true.
left? And say what you want about Ozzy, and you can maybe credit this to his management. Part of this to his management. Ozzy has managed to stay relevant through all the sea changes of grunge and everything that's come and gone, and he's basically now set himself up as sort of this iconic, legendary singer. Whereas if you look at the career of Dio, after the first couple Dio solo albums, Dio's career was never really quite the same. But going back to Black Sabbath, it always kind of felt like with Ozzy that it kind of felt like this guy that breaks up with his girlfriend, but then he's like always calling her, and even though they're fighting, they're still like remaining in touch with each other. And you would think like, well, if you hate each other so much, why do you call each other? Why do you?
Yeah.
Because you just, again, you look at their career, and I would put that into all the guys in the original Black Sabbath. Geezer was in on Cross Purposes. Bill Ward popped in here and there. I don't remember when the Tony Martin era. He played a couple live shows with them during the Tony Martin era.
Cross Purposes.
The reunions, the Live Aid reunions, the reunion around the Dehumanizer. It was just something that was always lingering. The fighting, like we talked about earlier, around the live albums. It was just like maybe in some ways, they realized that there is sort of this special chemistry that existed between the four of them. But that being said, when Dio came into the group, Dio is a very strong personality. Dio is a much different singer in a lot of different ways. He has a different voice. He writes his own lyrics. As the guys in the band have said, Dio would come in and say, hey, play this chord there instead. Do this chord progression, because Dio, he understood music in the sense that he played bass and everything, and he could express himself differently than Ozzy did. And I think that really pushed them to do some stuff that, was maybe a little bit more musically challenging in some ways than, what they did with Ozzy. But I think because they never, what would have happened if Dio had hung around for, let's say he had made 6 albums with the band before he left, would it have changed people's perception of the band? Going back to AC/DC, there's some people that, all they know is the Brian Johnson era of AC/DC because that stuff is so all over the radio. So I don't know, maybe if Dio had hung around longer and hadn't been kind of in and out of the band. But the reality is you can't get away from who Ozzy is. And look, when I saw them the last time they came through Tampa, multiple times throughout the show, people started chanting, and they weren't chanting Sabbath, Sabbath, Sabbath. They were chanting Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy. I mean, it's almost like it is what it is. He casts this massive shadow that.
Do you think that in the time that Dio was with Black Sabbath, that there were any songs that they released that were as, I'm trying to think of what word would apply, as iconic as songs like Iron Man, Paranoid, Children of the Grave, Sweet Leaf, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath? You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, well, certainly nothing from the Dio era gets
right.
the rotation on classic rock radio the way Paranoid, Iron Man does, War Pigs. And that's another reason why Ozzy is more associated with Black Sabbath than Dio is, because his stuff landed in that eternal classic rock rotation thing. I would say within the band, within the metal community, I would say a song like Heaven and Hell is as iconic
Right.
as the Dio, as the, Paranoid or Iron Man. But
Definitely.
beyond Heaven and Hell, and again, it's where people, when I came into the band, it was all kind of happening at the same time. I discovered Blizzard of Oz, I got Paranoid, and I got Heaven and Hell all like right around the exact same time. So there was no sort of confusion like, oh, I was listening to Heaven and Hell for a year, and then all of a sudden I figured out that, Ozzy was there, or I was listening to Ozzy. I didn't realize Ozzy wasn't in Black Sabbath anymore, but there are some people that feel that way. And again, because that era never achieved the status that the Ozzy era did. Whereas if you look at we keep coming back to AC/DC, but Back in Black was such a massively huge selling record that it wasn't the same as, Heaven and Hell didn't sell as many copies as Back in Black did. If Heaven and Hell had sold 20 million copies, maybe people would have forgot quicker about the Ozzy era. But it did well, but it wasn't the seismic shift that Back in Black was for AC/DC.
No, I think that Ozzy continued. Well, I think when Black Sabbath broke up, as far as the original lineup, and Ozzy went his way, and the remaining members went their way with Dio, I think that stylistically, the old Black Sabbath was gone. Black Sabbath turned into a heavy metal band, whereas before they were like, you could say, that the early Black Sabbath albums were, well, it's commonly regarded as they're commonly regarded as heavy metal albums, but to me, it's more like blues, heavy rock. By contrast to what Black Sabbath were doing when Dio joined, those were very metal albums. Ozzy, likewise, was also, his Blizzard of Oz was very dark. It had the the occult vibe with Mr. Crowley and Revelation, Mother Earth, not so much an occult, but in doom and gloom, which was a part of Sabbath, of course, but also like the heavier guitar playing, I guess, for lack of a better word, the more modern, maybe, style that Randy had was, straight from L.A., right? Quiet Riot was from L.A. It wasn't as much of a British blues sound anymore. Now it was more of a modern, heavy metal sound that was backing Ozzy's voice up. So I think both bands at that time had moved on to, you could say, greener pastures, and the old Black Sabbath with Tony and Geezer and Bill and Ozzy was now, it was there, but it wasn't relevant anymore as far as what these musicians were doing. But nevertheless, Black Sabbath continued with the name Black Sabbath and continued on. However, they never really got to the point where they were, commercially viable, I don't think. I love this stuff, don't get me wrong, and as a metalhead, for a metalhead, stuff is amazing, and I Bob Rules is one of my favorite heavy metal albums of all time, but it doesn't really quite have the same appeal that Black Sabbath. You can hear Black Sabbath, you can hear War Pigs, and you will hear Paranoid on classic rock stations, and it's like we just talked about a few minutes ago. You won't hear anything from Heaven and Hell or Mob Rules on classic rock stations. So there's that, which is a pretty significant thing. I think when any kind of artist or band can cross over, a few genres, well, classic rock, heavy metal, and, let's say basic, just modern rock, and have the audience, or have the fan base of those genres all relevant to rock, but have those that wide of an appeal, as opposed to the band that's currently existing as Black Sabbath, that's really pretty much focused on, by default, because of the elements that were involved in the music, pretty much focused on heavy metal. It gives the Ozzy legacy and the Ozzy solo career a distinct advantage, I think. And I would say that that's probably unfortunate for where Black Sabbath was in the 80s. I think that Ozzy's solo career boosted the popularity of his era of Black Sabbath, and it almost lent itself to a competition between the two eras.
Yeah, and
So,
the other thing is if okay, so when Dio leaves, he's very successful with Holy Diver, Last in Line, and Sacred Heart, and then pretty much it falls off the shelf. And if Dio had as long of a career, as successful as a solo career as Ozzy, and even if you match up Dio against, where Ozzy was in 83, 84, Ozzy was leaps and bounds above where Dio was. Maybe not leaps and bounds, but he was farther ahead than Dio was. And Ozzy, speak of the devil, he was always playing Sabbath songs, in his sets and everything. So, again, it's that thing. Maybe if Dio had this huge successful career and had been in the public eye the way Ozzy was, maybe it would have kept that era of the band alive a little bit more. But I think one of the things about Dio and the other thing too is when he came back for Dehumanizer, that album did not, call it timing, that album did not make an impact the way.
I think it's bad timing. I think that it was not the right time for that album. I mean, I loved it, but grunge, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Nirvana was in full swing. It was just bad timing.
Yeah, and so he just never had the successful run that Ozzy did. But one thing I will say, sounds like we're beating up on Dio a little bit, but and I love Dio. Don't get me wrong.
I did too.
Yeah, he's. The one thing that I will say, if I'm going to gripe about Ozzy, when it comes to live performances, performing their own material, let's say it that way, to me, Dio wins that hands down.
Oh, yeah.
Ozzy is such an inconsistent live singer. And I was so happy when everybody knows The Devil the band Heaven and Hell. It's Black Sabbath and everything but name.
Right.
But I was so glad that they didn't call that Black Sabbath, because I did not want to hear them go out on the road and them feeling obligated to have to play Iron Man and Paranoid. And when they did go out as Heaven and Hell, it really felt, and the guys in the band even said this, that everything was on the table to play. And they really played, some different things. Like they played Lonely Is the Word. It was just with Dio as the vocalist, they could do anything. Now with Ozzy, it's always been irritating to me. It's always been frustrating. His voice is hit or miss. You were talking about that Ritz show that became Speak of the Devil. For anybody out there that hasn't heard it, look it up on YouTube. You can hear bootlegs of it before Ozzy overdubbed his voice. He sounds horrendous.
Yeah,
he sounds terrible. And let's face it, Ozzy more often than not sounds bad live than he does good. And even so what upsets me with Ozzy because of that is, like, when they did these last tours that they've done ever since the reunion, basically, and not so much in the 99 reunion, because they did do some songs that were a little different in the beginning. You know, they were doing like Spiral Architect,
Hmm.
and
Dirty Women.
they did a little bit of Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. But really quickly, the set list just descended into the first three albums.
Yeah.
And it was really just because Ozzy can't sing this stuff live. And there's videos out there. I know you gave me a DVD once. I think it was it was in Birmingham at the early in one of their tours with Ozzy, and they tried Wheels of Confusion.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Ozzy never heard that song before.
I
It's
know.
like, it is beyond terrible. Now,
Yeah.
okay, so
It's cringy. It's
it is
cringy.
absolutely cringy. So, and even when they put out the 13 album, I distinctly remember Ozzy multiple times in interviews saying, I made sure that I didn't sing really high so that I could pull these songs off live. So what did they do? They came out of the gate and they were playing End of the Beginning. They played Loner, which Loner sounded absolutely dreadful. There's a video out there from Australia with Ozzy singing that. Word is just like he never heard the song before in his life. It is horrible. And eventually they landed up They did Methademic. They landed up dropping everything from the 13 album. And so it was all stuck with that same set list. You can say what you want. This is people. All right. I challenge people to go out and find a really terrible Ronnie James Dio performance.
Good point.
Seriously, dig around on YouTube through Rainbow, through his solo band. Okay. And don't confuse, because people will say this like, oh, you know, I listened to something from like when he did when he played all of Holy Diver when Doug Aldridge was in the band, and he did all of Holy Diver. So, you know, it doesn't sound as good as Holy Diver. Well, okay, he's singing in tune, he's singing in time. The tone of his voice has changed a little because of his age, but he's still in tune, he's still in time. His voice isn't cracking and blowing out, you know, all over the place.
He's not forgetting lyrics, you know.
Exactly. Whereas with Ozzy, it's just live, he is a mess. And so I almost resented that on these last tours where it was like, come on, man, you know, the same set list. If only Ozzy could sing. And then, this is just an observation, you know, after this last tour he did with Black Sabbath, I watched some clips of him live when he went out with his solo band. And I was like, you know, he actually sounds pretty good. And I thought, did he not put the homework in with Black Sabbath, or what is the problem? So with Dio, to me, Dio, he gets extra points for me with knowing that I can YouTube any Dio era Black Sabbath video and I know he's going to sound great. With Ozzy, it was total hit or miss. When Dio was in the band, they played anything from the albums was on the table to be sung live. And I don't care. And it's not an excuse. You know, when I see people on forums and they say, oh, you know, give Ozzy a break and all this other stuff. Well, no, you know, it's just either he should, if he can't sing the stuff, he should stop touring, or no, I go to hear the guy sing. I mean, I don't go there I was on a forum once and a guy said, well, you know, it's good enough for me just listening to him go cuckoo, you know, and stuff like that. And I thought to myself, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. You know, so Dio, hats off to Dio for what a great live, consistently great live vocalist he was, and points deducted from Ozzy for his live performances.
I think the Ozzy live experience was something that was more visual. I think that was something that I know, you know, it was more. Well, I know that when I wanted to see Ozzy in '82 on Diary, I mean, I wasn't allowed to go initially because there was a reputation that he was, you know, not only he was doing crazy things on stage, but the audience members were, you know, throwing fireworks and shit on stage, and it was like breaking beer bottles and stuff. That was, you know, course, that wasn't the case, but there was this reputation that Ozzy had live that, I mean, and as it went on, it got even worse. And then when he bit the head off the bat on stage, then people were saying, oh, he wouldn't play unless, the audience were killing animals, and he was sawing. One ridiculous rumor was that he was sawing the legs off a Doberman Pinscher on stage. It just got, it got totally blown out of proportion. But that's what an Ozzy Osbourne concert was. I mean, it was like you wanted to, there was all these rumors, there was all this hype about how crazy he was and how crazy these concerts were. So you were going there to see Ozzy. And really, it's kind of unfair to the musicians who were so good, like Brad Gillis and, of course, Randy Rhoads. But I mean, even after Randy Rhoads died, he always had outstanding musicians in his band. And Jake and Rudy and Tommy Aldridge, Carmine Appice. He always had a great band, but people didn't go there to hear him sing necessarily and to hear the band. They just wanted to see what he was going to do, how crazy these concerts were, So the distinction was that Dio was a professional. He was a musician. He was also an entertainer, but first and foremost, he was a lead singer. He was a vocalist, and that was where the priority was. He was also very personable. He had a good rapport with the audience. He made them feel like everybody was in the same room. I mean, we've seen them together, and I saw Dio in '84 with the Last in Line, on tour for the Last in Line, and he loved playing Philadelphia, and everybody in that audience felt like they were pretty much interacting with Dio, and even when we saw him in, 2007, somebody threw up a banner, and he walked over, he picked the banner up and he held it up, and he was talking to a couple people in the front. I mean, he had a great rapport with the audience, but like you said, he was also on point professionally. He would never forget the lyrics. If his voice was off, it was almost okay, because it still sounded good, and it only added to the experience of it not being exactly the same as it was on the record. You had something special. Oh, he sang that a little differently. Well, that's part of my concert. That's part of my live experience I'm having with Dio, So it was even better if he sang it a little differently. With Ozzy, I mean, his voice is just a fucking mess, but you were there. What was he wearing? What did he look like? And part of it, you wanted to see it crash and burn. I mean, I know I saw Ozzy with Metallica in '87, and he forgot the lyrics to Flying High again. And I could see Jakey. I mean, he was just at the mic, and he just wasn't singing anything. And Jake kind of like sashayed over and leaned into Ozzy, and you could see that he was whispering in his ear, and he kind of got Ozzy jump started again. And then, he remembered the lyrics, or at least mumbled something that closely resembled what he was supposed to be singing. But it was entertaining. I'm like, oh my God, this is really happening. He forgot the lyrics to the song, completely inexcusable in a Dio situation. But for Ozzy, hey man, it was all part of it. That's Ozzy,
Yeah, and that's part of we said really early on. I mentioned that, Ozzy always has this this lovable clown, lovable goofball. He's the guy at the bar that's spilling drinks all over himself, and everybody's laughing. Laughing. He's laughing, and everybody's laughing along with him. That was always kind of Ozzy. So people want to root for Ozzy, and I mean, I want to root for Ozzy too. He is an iconic guy, and he's just that kind of guy. You want to root for him, and it seems to me like in the early '80s, I think he still had his voice together. It was really like towards the the reunion era when things really got rough with his vocal. But he was even during the '70s, and he's always been inconsistent as anybody. I know you have a lot of Sabbath bootlegs, and so do I. And you just, that's always the thing you're waiting for, is to hear what Ozzy's voice is going to sound like. Because just sometimes when he's on, he's
He's great.
He's just incredible. But
Well, there's actually maybe only a couple of years where I could say that he was really in top form. It's certainly the early shows, from like 70 to 71, I think
yeah,
were all pretty
an early
strong.
Sabotage tour, like right
Yeah,
before Sabotage came out, there's that, that soundboard from, where is that, Rhode Island or Maryland or something.
there's
It
a
was
couple
on the
of them.
Past Lives thing.
Yeah, there was one from Asbury Park.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, Asbury Park. Yeah.
Well, no, there was another one from New England too, and both of them were great. I mean, like, actually, Ozzy sounds better than anybody. I mean, as you're going to talk about the quality of the performance, I mean, everybody was on point, but Ozzy was just, I think they did
Yeah.
Megalomania, and it was like, wow. Because remember, we were listening to it in the car. We were on our way to a show, I think when we played somewhere up in Rochester, we were listening to that. I don't think you'd heard it yet, but you were like, my God, this sounds excellent. And I'm like, yeah, it does. I mean, it's one of the rare Sabbath concerts that, you can actually say, hey, man, Ozzy sounds great.
And it wasn't like they were doing easy material then. That was when they were doing Hole in the Sky and Symptom of the
Yeah.
Universe, and right. And I think part of it, I think what happened with him is when they went to Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. If you're not a guitar player, you might not notice this, but the Never Say Die VHS, the albums before Technical Ecstasy, Sabotage, Master of Reality, and Volume 4 were all tuned down to C sharp. Well,
Okay.
when they got to Never Say Die, they tuned back up to regular pitch, essentially making everything 3 notes higher. So when you see Ozzy singing Snowblind in Symptom of the Universe, and any of that stuff from those Master of Reality, Sabotage, Volume 4 on that Never Say Die tour, he's singing it higher than it was on the record. And in my opinion, that's where just you hear his voice on that Never Say Die tour, and he has this croaky like sound to his voice. And I think, he just, that's where he really, I think, ruined his voice, was when they started they weren't tuned down anymore, and he was trying to sing all that stuff, even higher than it was on the record, which was already crazy high. Stuff like Symptom of the Universe was already,
Yeah.
very high, and it just destroyed his voice. In the first couple of years of his solo career, I think he was still pretty on point. It really wasn't until maybe the 90s where it sort of got off a little bit. But
Yeah, I think if you've seen the After Hours video, and I'm sure you have, that was basically live in a television studio, and he sounds pretty good, but there's a lot of bad notes, and it's not real strong, and you can tell you could tell by his facial expression. I think particularly.
Crazy Train, right? He goes for the one high note and he just misses it by like a
Yeah,
mile.
and he's like holding the mic and kind of like like he's getting frustrated. But I mean, Ozzy. I mean, Dio. I don't think Dio was a drug user. I mean, I think probably everybody in that era did dabble with things from time to time. It was the '80s or it was the '70s, and it was part of the culture at that time. But I don't think anybody dabbled quite as much as Ozzy probably did, and it definitely took a toll. Dio was a smoker, I think, most of his career, and that didn't really seem to affect his voice. I mean, obviously, he was still singing great, even in 2009. Now you can hear, his voice started to diminish a little bit, but I mean, for someone his age, I mean, I'm not sure how much of it was because of not taking care of his voice or because he was just getting it was like late 60s at that point,
Yeah.
But Ozzy just, was a mess, I mean, and so even during that 78 tour where that video, that Never Say Die video, was filmed, there's things about it that I like. I mean, I like the version of Snowblind on it. I like some of his inflections in between the lines. So much so that I listened for that, and I prefer to hear that live version of Snowblind as opposed to the studio version. But in other aspects, he's whacked out of his head. I mean, they're all coked up, and I don't know how anybody could tour under those conditions and perform every night, in a way that would be somewhat professional, you know. Uh, and again, it comes back to, probably that was the era. I mean, I think most of the people in the audience were probably just as messed up, if not more so, than the people on stage. And it was like a party. That's what a concert was. So I think our generation, maybe we were more in tune with the performances and things, but the generation before that, the 70s generation, I don't think they were just there to have a good time. I don't think they really criticized performance that much, as long as the people on stage seemed to be giving it their all and seemed to be into the moment. It was good enough. In the 80s, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, going back to something I said earlier too, you just can't get away from the fact that Ozzy has such a unique voice. I saw somebody from his solo band was saying that they would do this thing on the tour bus where they would ask Ozzy to sing something like Jingle Bells or Mary Had a Little Lamb, and no matter what he sang, it sounded evil. You can sort of picture Ozzy singing Jingle Bells or something, and it sounds heavy metal, it sounds evil, and that's kind of the Ozzy, what Ozzy brings to the table, and the Ozzy voice. So, I mean, I guess to summarize for me, I think they're two different singers. The band went in different directions. Dio certainly brought his own thing to the table. His iconic voice, his writing, his stamp. You listen to a song like Lady Evil, to me, that's very Dio sounding. That sounds like it could have been on one of his solo albums.
Yep.
So, Dio brought a strong personality. Ozzy is Ozzy. Ozzy was the first guy. He had more records with the band. His songs are all over classic rock. He had a more successful continued solo career than Dio did. Who wins? I love them both. I think if I had to be forced into picking one over the other, I mean, I'd probably go to the Dio era, honestly, a little bit more, because it feels a little... I grab an album like The Humanizer because I haven't heard that as many times as I've heard Paranoid, but still reach for the early stuff and find things I love out of the early stuff. And I love them all equally, like kids, like your kids, you love them all equally for different, they have different personalities, but you still love them all the same.
Yeah. I'm torn. I mean, I there's times when I really gravitate more toward the Dio era, and other times when I listen to the Ozzy era and I'm just, I'm like, wow, this is just amazing. Like I recently been listening to Volume 4 a lot, and I think that's an incredible album. But that whole era of Ozzy fronted Sabbath is very special, and it has a lot of unique qualities about it that are only present when those musicians are together. 13, a lot of people criticizing that, Bill Ward should have been on the album, and we've gone back and forth. How many times Bill's been absent versus how many times he's actually been a part of the band, and how relevant it is that he's not part of the band. It doesn't really matter, but yet it kind of does, because there is a chemistry there, and with those four members. And once that was changed, then it wasn't the same band. But there's a lot to like about the Dio era. There was a different vibe. There was more of a professional attitude about the music that certainly is a great quality. And the songwriting was great. And they're just it really isn't a versus thing, and that's how we started this segment. It's not a competition, but personally, I wish people were more accepting. I wish there wasn't this divide. I wish people would say, I love the Ozzy version of Sabbath for what it is, but I really like the Dio version of Sabbath for what it is too. And it's all part of the same band, just different personalities. That's how I qualify it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. All right. Well, I think that might be a good note to leave it on. Any other? I think we both agree they each era has its own thing, brings its own thing to the table.
Okay, real quick, one last thing. So when we're going all the way to the end, and we have two examples of, let's say, current Ozzy Sabbath and relatively current Geo Sabbath. So we have the Heaven and Hell band versus 13. Which one wins for you?
I was gonna ask you the same question. Wow, I never really thought about that before now. Boy, I hate to say it, Mike, because I do dump on 13. I've been known to sort of have my issues with 13. The fact that they played it so safe, the fact that, and I do like The Devil You Know, but I don't know. If you force my hand, I might go 13.
Okay.
I think it's just a little more enjoyable. Maybe it's a guilty fun because it's so safe. And the issues that I have with The Devil You Know, the mix is a little strange. Some of the songs aren't very memorable. I like Adam and Evil and like the first couple songs and maybe the last song on the record, but I don't rank either of them as being like 10 out of 10s or spectacular albums. But I guess if I had to force my hand, I've let's put it to you this way: I've listened to 13 more than I've listened to The Devil You Know.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in the same place with that. I've listened to 13 a lot more. It's cool because I never thought I'd hear Ozzy singing on a Black Sabbath album. It wasn't as big a deal to hear Dio back with Black Sabbath as it was with Ozzy. Maybe some of that is just the novelty of the situation. But you're right. It's a very safe. 13 is very safe. It's very, it's basically mimicking, the first three albums, primarily Paranoid. But, in a similar way, Heaven and Hell kind of more or less follows the Heaven and Hell album and tries to capture the mob rules, that early 80s era of the band. And to me, it doesn't sound like everybody's on the same page. It sounds like the music was written, recorded, and then Dio came in and sang over top of it. He didn't seem like he was as integrated in the material as he had been on previous albums.
And it sounds like Vinny Appice was brought in at the last minute to do his parts. It just, to me, The Devil You Know, 13 sounds more like a Black Sabbath album than The Devil You Know does. If you try to say, okay, does The Devil You Know, maybe I might compare The Devil You Know more to Dehumanizer because there's more of the slow songs and stuff like that. But, and 13, maybe it's just because they played it safe. They came in and they knew, okay, we're going to try to make an album that sounds like the first three or four albums. But it's kind of guilty fun. Maybe the 13 is, I don't know, the songs just stand out to me more. I remember them more. Maybe that's again because they sort of tried to play by the numbers a little bit more. But The Devil You Know, if you had asked me when those albums first came out, I would have said The Devil You Know, but I don't reach for The Devil You Know as much anymore.
No, I don't.
I don't listen to it as much, and it would have been interesting to see where they would have gone with it. But I think maybe if they had had a producer like Rick Rubin, maybe they could have gotten better results. I think that's the only way that 13 was able to work is that they had to get a producer. They had to get somebody that was really going to try to keep them focused and give them a game plan and keep them on task.
I'm not sure how much of an asset Rick Rubin was to that album. I think he really pushed them in the direction of trying to, rehash old material into a new album. I think he pushed them in that direction. Maybe if they had a producer, Martin Birch, or somebody that was a little bit more less interested in trying to put a feather in his cap like Rick Rubin was about, producing a Black Sabbath album and sort of making it sound like earlier records, so that he had that credential of like making an iconic Black Sabbath record. If somebody just let them do what they wanted to do, it might have been a lot better. I mean, who knows what ideas were originally presented and thrown out
Well,
because
if you remember, they did try to record an album, like I think
yeah,
in the late '90s, and there was a song they were playing
Scary
live.
Dream.
Scary Dreams, right? So, I think the only way that you were going to get anything out of them at that point in their lives and their careers was, and Rick Rubin is famous for coming in, taking artists, getting them to go back to their original sound. He did it with Johnny Cash, slightly reinventing people, but he always goes back to, the classic sound, and that's kind of Rick Rubin's thing. But there was probably also just a lot of lawyers and accountants and managers, and it took a whole army of people, multiple years to get them to that point where those guys could sit in a room together and put something together. And is it the album that I wish it was a little bit more challenging? I wish they had tried tried some different things. I wish they had done that. They didn't. It's still a pretty good album, and it's probably was the best Black Sabbath album we were going to get out of those guys at that point in time.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've covered it. To summarize, each era, it has its own thing, and in the end, we love them all for what they are. They wouldn't be Black Sabbath if you didn't have, if you didn't have Dio, if you didn't have Ozzy.
Yeah, I think moving forward, I think the one thing that I want to try to get across through our discussions is that every era of Black Sabbath has a lot of good things about it. When we start getting into the Tony Martin era, we'll start talking about some of the virtues of those albums that are largely overlooked by people in favor of the Ozzy and the Dio. So I mean, it's kind of important, I think, to get the Ozzy Dio thing out of the way, so we don't need to reference that so much in the context of Black Sabbath, and we can start really, when we start analyzing or getting into a critical discussion about Tony Martin eras, we can just sort of qualify them on their own merits. But I mean, there's something. It's not just Ozzy. It's not just Dio. We get into Born Again. Which will be interesting because it's probably one of my least favorite Black Sabbath albums for a number of reasons. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a lot of people's favorite.
Yeah,
so
it's become a cult classic over the years for a lot of
yeah.
people. Yeah, and I probably should have said this at the beginning. We weren't excluding any of the other eras, especially the Tony Martin era, because we don't think it's valid or anything like that. We just thought that, when most people, the Ozzy versus Dio thing is sort of the elephant in the room, so to speak, and that's why we wanted to address that with its own particular episode. And we are certainly going to cover every era of the band. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening. We do have a Facebook page out there. I believe we haven't quite set it up yet, but it should be facebook.com/Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. So you can reach out to us there. Let us know what you think of the episode, your thoughts on the Ozzy versus Dio discussion. We'll also be posting the audio of this on YouTube, and it will be available on all the streaming services. So make sure you comment, let us know what you think, let us know some things you may want us to cover in the future. Mm-hmm. And for that, we are out for now. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.